At 11:32 on the morning of November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail section of a B-17 flying fortress named Rikki Tikki Tavi, watching German fighters swarm toward his bomber like angry hornets. 19 years old, a farm boy from Wisconsin, his first combat mission over a heavily defended target. The 8th Air Force had sent over 300 bombers to destroy Bremen's factories that morning. German defenders had already shot down 6 flying fortresses in the first hour. Moran's position was the loneliest on the aircraft. The tail gunner sat on a bicycle-style seat at the very back of the bomber, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of fuselage. His only company was a pair of .50 caliber machine guns and the German fighters trying to kill him. In the next 14 minutes, German cannon fire would cut his bomber in half at 24,000 feet. The tail section, with Moran still inside, would separate from the aircraft and begin tumbling toward Earth. And as he fell 4.5 miles through freezing air with no parachute, Eugene Moran would keep his fingers on the triggers, firing at German fighters all the way down. This is the story of the tail gunner who refused to stop shooting even when his aircraft disintegrated around him. How he survived a fall that should have killed him instantly. How he spent 17 months as a prisoner of war with injuries that should have been fatal. And how he kept silent about it all for 60 years because the memories were too painful to share. The B-17 carried 10 men, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, flight engineer in the top turret, radio operator behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners standing at open windows, ball turret gunner hanging beneath the aircraft in a glass sphere, and Moran alone in the tail. The tail gunner's job was simple: protect the bomber's most vulnerable angle. German pilots had learned early in the war that attacking from directly behind a B-17 put them in the firing arc of only one man, the tail gunner. By November 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a catastrophic rate. The mission to Schweinfurt 2 months earlier had cost 60 flying fortresses in a single day. 600 men killed or captured in one afternoon. Bomber crews called deep missions into Germany milk runs to hell. The mathematics of survival were brutal. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions to go home. Statistical analysis showed the average crew lasted 15 missions. Some groups were losing half their aircraft every month. Eugene Paul Moran was born May 17, 1924, on a dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. Crawford County. Population 672. The farm sat in the valley along the Kickapoo River, surrounded by wooded hills. Moran's family worked the land, dairy cows, crops, the same life generations before them had lived. Hard work, long hours, no luxuries. But they had enough. Eugene was the youngest of 3 children. His father died when Eugene was 12. The farm fell to his older brothers. Eugene helped when he could, but he dreamed of something else: aircraft. He would lie in the pasture watching planes pass overhead, imagining what it would be like to fly. The nearest airfield was 50 miles away. He'd never been in an aircraft, never even seen one up close, but the dream stayed with him. When Pearl Harbor happened, Moran was 17, too young to enlist. He waited, finished his final year of high school, turned 18 on May 17, 1942. Enlisted the next day. The Army Air Forces needed gunners, young men with quick reflexes and steady nerves, farm boys who knew how to shoot. Moran fit the profile perfectly. Gunnery training at Tyndall Field, Florida. They taught him to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire in short bursts to prevent his barrels from overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of German fighters: Messerschmitt, Bf 109, Focke-Wulf 190. He could identify them at 2,000 yards, but training could not prepare anyone for the reality of combat over Germany. The cold at 24,000 feet dropped to 40 below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The thin air made every movement exhausting, and the German fighters came in waves, firing 20-millimeter cannons that could tear through aluminum like paper. Moran shipped to England in October 1943. He was assigned to the 96th Bombardment Group at Snetterton Heath. The 96th flew B-17s on daylight bombing missions over occupied Europe and Germany. Deep penetration raids, maximum danger. The tail gunner position had the highest casualty rate in the Air Force. 38% never finished their 25-mission tour. The Germans knew the tail was isolated. Kill the tail gunner and the bomber's 6 o'clock was undefended. Moran trained with his crew through October. Practice flights, formation flying, gunnery drills. The pilot was a lieutenant from Ohio. The navigator was Jesse Orison from Arkansas. Good men, professional. They'd get Moran home if anyone could. His first mission was scheduled for late November. Target, Bremen. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens, one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. November 29, 1943. Briefing at 0400 hours. The intelligence officer pulled back the curtain covering the mission map. A red line stretched from England across the North Sea into northern Germany. Bremen. Expected opposition, heavy. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 200 fighters along the route. Flak batteries ringed every approach to the city. Losses were anticipated. Moran checked his equipment: heated flight suit, oxygen mask, parachute. The parachute was critical. If the bomber went down, the silk canopy was the only thing between survival and a 4-mile fall. Rikki Tikki Tavi took off from Snetterton Heath at 07:15 as part of a formation of 300 bombers. They climbed to altitude over England, formed up into defensive boxes, each B-17 positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was simple: pack the bombers close together so their combined firepower could drive off enemy fighters. The reality was that a direct hit on one aircraft often damaged those flying beside it. Moran settled into his tail position as they crossed the North Sea. The compartment measured 4 feet wide, 5 feet long. He knelt on a pad, facing backward, watching England disappear behind them. The tail position had windows on 3 sides, clear plexiglass, good visibility. But the plexiglass offered no protection. A 20-millimeter cannon shell would punch through it like cardboard. His twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns pointed backward through the rear window. 400 rounds per gun, 800 total. Enough for perhaps 3 sustained engagements. The cold was immediate and brutal. Outside temperature, 40 below zero. Inside wasn't much warmer. The electrically heated suit helped, but Moran's breath still formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. They crossed into German airspace at 10:15. Bremen was still 30 minutes away. The bomber stream flew at 24,000 feet above most of the weather, exposed to everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. At 10:45, the flak started. Lac bursts filled the sky. 88-millimeter anti-aircraft shells exploding at altitude, throwing shrapnel in every direction. The bombers could not maneuver during the bomb run. They had to fly straight and level while the bombardiers lined up their targets. Moran watched a B-17 in the formation ahead take a direct hit. The aircraft folded in half and dropped from the sky like a stone. No parachutes. 10 men gone in an instant. Rikki Tikki Tavi released its bombs over Bremen at 11:17. 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the factories below. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight home. The bomber formation began its turn toward England. 200 miles of hostile airspace between them and safety. That's when Rikki Tikki Tavi's No. 2 engine took a direct hit from flak. The explosion was deafening. The propeller windmilled uselessly. The engine nacelle trailed black smoke. The aircraft began losing speed. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was a death sentence. German fighter pilots watched for stragglers. A lone B-17 without the protection of mass defensive fire was easy prey. Moran saw them coming, a dozen Messerschmitts climbing from below, another group of Focke-Wulfs diving from above. Rikki Tikki Tavi was about to fight alone against overwhelming odds, and in the tail gunner position, Eugene Moran would be their first target. The first Messerschmitt came in from the 6 o'clock low position, directly behind and beneath the bomber. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and squeezed the triggers. His twin .50 calibers roared to life. Tracers streamed toward the fighter. The German pilot broke off his attack and rolled away. But there were more. Many more. The Focke-Wulfs attacked in pairs. One would draw the gunner's attention while the other lined up a killing shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target, spent brass casings piled up around his knees. The smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment. The machine guns grew hot from continuous firing, while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. The German pilots were professionals, Luftwaffe veterans who had been fighting since 1939. They knew exactly how to kill a B-17. Target the engines first. A bomber with damaged engines couldn't keep up with its formation. Then, work on the gunners. Eliminate the defensive fire. Finally, pour cannon rounds into the fuselage until something vital broke. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. 20mm cannon shells punching through aluminum, the sound of tearing metal. Somewhere forward, one of the waist gunners stopped firing. Then the other. The intercom filled with static and fragments of voices. Moran couldn't tell who was speaking or what they were saying. The bomber shuddered as more rounds struck home. He kept firing. There was nothing else he could do. A Focke-Wulf came in from the 4 o'clock position. Moran swung his guns and pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated. It spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill. He didn't have time to celebrate. Cannon rounds ripped through the tail section. Moran felt something slam into his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves. The pain was immediate and intense, but his hands still worked. He could still grip the triggers. More impacts. The vertical stabilizer above him took multiple hits. Control cables snapped and whipped through the air. The tail section began vibrating violently. Something was very wrong with the aircraft. Moran glanced down at his parachute. Every airman wore one. The silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. If the bomber went down, the parachute was his only chance of survival. He saw holes in the fabric, multiple holes. Cannon rounds had shredded it. His parachute was useless. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to his death. The attack continued. German fighters made pass after pass. Moran counted at least 15 of them circling the crippled bomber. Rikki Tikki Tavi was bleeding altitude and speed. The remaining engines strained to keep the aircraft airborne. Forward in the nose section, navigator Jesse Orison was still alive. He'd been wounded but remained conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were fighting to maintain control. The flight engineer called out damage reports over the intercom. The radio operator was transmitting distress signals. The waist gunners were dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. Moran was alone in the tail, firing at fighters he could barely track through blood-smeared plexiglass. Then, the world exploded. A German cannon shell hit the fuselage directly behind the radio compartment. The 20mm round detonated inside the aircraft. The explosion severed the main structural members connecting the tail section to the rest of the bomber. Moran felt the tail break free. The entire rear section of Rikki Tikki Tavi from the aft bomb bay bulkhead back separated from the aircraft. The tail section, with Moran inside, began tumbling toward Earth. 24,000 feet above Bremen, Germany. The world became chaos. The severed tail section spun like a leaf. Sky, ground, sky, ground. Moran couldn't tell which way was up. The G-forces threw him against the sides of the compartment. His wounded arms screamed in pain. The twin .50 caliber guns were still mounted in front of him, still loaded, still functional. Through the spinning, through the blood, through the pain and terror, Eugene Moran kept firing. A German fighter flashed past. Moran tracked it instinctively, squeezed the triggers. Tracers followed the Messerschmitt. The fighter broke away. The tail section fell. 23,000 feet, 22,000. The air grew thicker, warmer. Moran's oxygen mask had been torn away. He gasped for breath. Another fighter. Closer this time. Moran fired. The Focke-Wulf pilot must have thought he was seeing a ghost. A severed tail section falling through the sky, machine guns still blazing. 20,000 feet, 19,000. The tail section was tumbling slower now. The aerodynamics had stabilized slightly. It was falling like a badminton shuttlecock, nose down, relatively flat. Moran was still firing. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. His arms were useless from the cannon wounds, but his fingers stayed on the triggers. 15,000 feet. A Messerschmitt dove past. Moran swung his guns, tracked, fired his last rounds. The tracers missed. His ammunition was gone. He was falling in a destroyed tail section with no parachute and no ammunition. 12,000 feet above hostile territory. The farm boy from Wisconsin who'd dreamed of flying while lying in pastures was about to discover what falling felt like when there was nothing to stop you. 10,000 feet. The tail section's flat spin had stabilized. It was falling almost vertically now, slightly nose down. The air resistance was tremendous. The plexiglass windows had shattered. Wind roared through the compartment. Moran wedged himself between the gun mounts and the bicycle seat. If he stayed in the tail section, maybe its mass would slow the fall. Maybe the structure would absorb some of the impact. Maybe he'd survive. 7,000 feet. He could see the ground now. Fields, forest, a river. The terrain was rushing up fast. 5,000 feet. Moran tried to position himself to absorb the impact. His wounded arms were useless. He braced with his legs, pressed his back against the steel armor plate. 3,000 feet. The tail section was falling at approximately 120 miles per hour. Terminal velocity for the structure, given its shape and weight. Still fast enough to kill instantly on impact. 2,000 feet. He could see individual trees now, houses, a road, the world filling his vision. 1,000 feet. Eugene Moran closed his eyes and prayed. The tail section hit the ground at 0947 hours, approximately 6 miles southeast of Bremen. It struck a plowed field, nose first, then cartwheeled across frozen earth. The impact was catastrophic. The structure disintegrated, metal tore, the tail section broke into pieces. Moran was thrown from the wreckage, still strapped to the bicycle seat and chest armor plate. He tumbled across the field, the armor plate beneath him, the seat above, rolling, bouncing, sliding. He stopped moving. Silence. Moran lay in a frozen German field, still alive, though he couldn't understand how. Both arms were shattered, his ribs were broken, his skull was fractured. Internal injuries he couldn't identify sent waves of pain through his body. But he was breathing. German soldiers found him 20 minutes later. A Wehrmacht patrol that had seen the tail section fall. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, expecting to find a corpse. Moran was conscious. Barely. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but his eyes were open. The German soldiers stared in disbelief. No one survived a fall from 24,000 feet. It was impossible. Yet here was an American airman, broken but alive, lying in a field surrounded by the wreckage of his aircraft. They called for a medic. The German medic examined Moran's injuries and shook his head. Both arms fractured in multiple places. Compound fractures, bone protruding through skin. At least 6 ribs broken. Skull fracture. Possible internal bleeding. The American would die within hours without surgery. The medic did what he could. Morphine for the pain, bandages to stop the bleeding, splints for the arms. Then they loaded Moran onto a truck and drove him to a hospital in Bremen, the same city he'd just bombed. The hospital was overwhelmed. Allied bombing raids had created hundreds of casualties. German civilians, soldiers, prisoners. The doctors were working around the clock. Moran was an enemy combatant, a prisoner. He should have been low priority. But the doctor who examined him was intrigued by the impossible survival. How had this American lived through a fall that should have killed him? The doctor operated that night. He set Moran's arms, inserted metal pins to hold the bones in place. He wired the broken ribs. He drilled into Moran's skull to relieve pressure from the fracture. The surgery took 6 hours. Moran survived. He woke 3 days later in a prisoner ward. His arms were in casts. His chest was wrapped in bandages. A metal plate had been installed in his skull where the bone had fractured. The pain was constant, overwhelming. But he was alive. German authorities transferred him to Stalag Luft 4, a prisoner of war camp near the Baltic coast. The camp held approximately 8,000 Allied airmen. Conditions were brutal. Insufficient food, no heat. Disease was rampant. Moran arrived in January 1944. He spent the next 14 months in Stalag Luft 4, learning to survive on starvation rations. His arms healed slowly, improperly. The breaks had been severe. The pins the German doctor inserted helped, but Moran would never regain full use of either arm. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches. His ribs had healed, but breathing was difficult. Every breath reminded him of November 29, 1943. He never talked about the fall. The other prisoners asked. Everyone had heard the story. The tail gunner who fell from 24,000 feet and lived. Moran would shake his head and change the subject. The memories were too fresh, too painful. In February 1945, with Soviet forces approaching from the east, the Germans evacuated Stalag Luft 4. Approximately 6,000 prisoners were force-marched westward. The march became known as the Black March. 86 days, 600 miles, through winter, no shelter, minimal food. Prisoners died every day. Exhaustion, starvation, disease. The Germans shot those who couldn't keep up. Moran marched with his compound still healing. His arms ached constantly. His ribs sent sharp pains with every breath. But he kept walking, one step, then another. Survival became simple mathematics. Keep moving or die. The march ended on April 26, 1945. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column near the Elbe River. The German guards threw down their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. After years of captivity, after months of marching, after countless moments when death seemed certain, they were free. Moran weighed 93 pounds. He'd entered the army at 150. The crash, the surgeries, the camps, and the march had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin, but he was alive. Medical personnel rushed to treat the liberated prisoners. Many required immediate hospitalization. Typhus had spread through the column during the march. Pneumonia was rampant. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes that would need amputation. The doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been systematically starved and brutalized for months or years. The Army processed Moran's case with growing astonishment. His service record documented the impossible. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943, aircraft destroyed by enemy action, fell 24,000 feet in severed tail section without functional parachute, survived impact, captured by enemy forces, held as prisoner of war for 17 months, survived forced march of approximately 600 miles, Military historians would later confirm that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire Second World War survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes. Eugene Moran was one of them. The other 2 had similar stories of wreckage riding, where pieces of destroyed aircraft slowed their descent enough to make survival possible. All 3 cases were considered miraculous. The Army awarded Moran 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he sustained during the attack on his bomber, 1 for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. They gave him the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force. They gave him the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. They gave him an honorable discharge on December 1, 1945. The 96 Bomb Group had lost 938 men during the war. 206 aircraft destroyed. Thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly in an organization defined by catastrophic losses. News of his fall had spread even during the war. Radio operators had intercepted German broadcasts describing an American who fell 4 miles and lived. The story reached Wisconsin, where Moran's family had spent months not knowing if he was alive or dead. Anonymous letters arrived describing what the radio operators had heard. Hope mixed with uncertainty until official confirmation finally came. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran returned to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin in late 1945. The farm boy who had dreamed of flying while watching planes pass overhead. The tail gunner who fell from the sky and refused to die. He was 21 years old. He had aged decades. The question now was whether he could build a life after everything he had endured. Eugene Moran married Margaret Finley a few months after returning to Wisconsin. She was a local girl who had known him before the war. She saw past the physical scars, the hollow eyes, the nightmares that woke him screaming in the darkness. She saw the man underneath the damage. They built a life together on a small farm near Soldiers Grove, the same landscape where Moran had grown up watching airplanes pass overhead and dreaming of flight. Now those dreams had been replaced by memories he could never fully escape. The roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the sound of aluminum tearing apart at 24,000 feet. Moran rarely spoke about the war, not to his wife, not to his 9 children, not to anyone who asked. The experiences were too painful, the losses too profound. 8 of his crewmates had died on Rikki Tikki Tavi. Countless friends had perished in the camps and on the march. Talking about it meant reliving it. So he stayed silent for more than 60 years. The physical wounds never fully healed. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms remained weak and prone to pain in cold weather. His ribs ached when storms approached. His body carried the evidence of November 29, 1943, until his final breath. But Moran lived. He raised his family. He worked his farm. He attended church on Sundays and watched his grandchildren grow. He outlived most of his fellow prisoners and nearly all of his fellow crewmen. The farm boy who should have died a dozen times over instead lived to see the 21st century. In 2007, more than 6 decades after the war ended, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They chose Eugene Moran as the first recipient. Finally, officially, his state recognized what he had endured and what he had survived. The award ceremony brought attention to his story. Journalists interviewed him. Historians documented his account. A local teacher named John Armbruster became fascinated by the tale and began conducting extensive interviews with Moran and his family. The silence of 60 years finally broke. Armbruster spent years researching every detail: military records, German archives, interviews with surviving witnesses. The project would eventually become a book titled Tailspin, published in 2022. A complete account of the farm boy who fell 4 miles and lived. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove, honored Moran by naming a street after him, Eugene Moran Way, a permanent marker in the community where he was born, where he returned after the war, and where he spent the rest of his life. The other survivor of Rikki Tikki Tavi also returned home. Navigator Jesse Orison had bailed out of the forward section before the bomber broke apart. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner alongside thousands of other Allied airmen. His testimony confirmed Moran's account and helped establish the historical record of that November morning over Bremen. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. He was 89 years old. 7 decades had passed since the day German flak cut his bomber in half and sent him tumbling 4 miles toward Earth. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the world spun around him. 7 decades since German doctors saved his life with crude tools and impossible skill. His obituary noted that he lived by a simple philosophy: I would rather wear out than rust out. The words of a man who refused to surrender. To the Germans, to his injuries, to the march, to the silence that followed. The tail gunner position on a B-17 was the loneliest spot on the aircraft, separated from the crew, first target for enemy fighters, last to know if the bomber was going down. Eugene Moran occupied that position on November 29, 1943, and when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not curl up and wait for death. He kept shooting all the way down. The German fighters that day reported something impossible over their radios: a destroyed tail section falling through the sky, still firing. Machine guns blazing from wreckage that shouldn't have anyone alive inside it. They thought they were seeing a ghost. They were seeing Eugene Moran, a 19-year-old farm boy from Wisconsin who refused to accept that his war was over, who kept his fingers on the triggers even when falling through 4 miles of sky, who survived the unsurvivable through physics, luck, and sheer will to live. The story challenges everything we think we know about what's possible. Falls from 24,000 feet are fatal, always, except when they're not. Except when a tail section tumbles in exactly the right way, creates exactly the right aerodynamic profile, hits frozen ground at exactly the right angle. Except when an American tail gunner is still firing his guns while falling because that's his job, and he's going to do it until he can't anymore. Except when German doctors see an enemy prisoner who should be dead and decide to save him anyway because medicine transcends war. Except when a prisoner survives a death march that killed thousands because quitting wasn't in his vocabulary. Moran's survival required dozens of impossible things happening in sequence. Any one of them failing meant death. But they all succeeded, and a farm boy from Wisconsin went home, built a life, raised a family, and kept quiet about it for 60 years because he didn't think his story was special. That's what the greatest generation never understood about themselves. Their stories were special. Their survival was miraculous. Their service deserved recognition. But they stayed silent because they were too humble to demand it. Eugene Moran kept shooting all the way down, not because he thought he'd survive. He knew he was dead. The parachute was destroyed. The tail section was falling. There was no escape. He kept shooting because it was his job, because 8 of his crewmates were depending on him, because surrender wasn't an option even when death was certain. That's heroism, not the survival. The refusal to quit when quitting was the rational choice. The tail section of Rikki Tikki Tavi no longer exists. The wreckage was cleared from that German field decades ago. The hospital where Moran was treated was destroyed in later raids. Stalag Luft 4 is gone. The route of the Black March is unmarked. But Eugene Moran Way remains in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, a street named for a man who fell from the sky and refused to die. And now you know his name. Now you know his story. Now you're part of keeping his memory alive. The tail gunner who kept shooting all the way down.